Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Andrew Ramsey, and I'm the Social Planning and Affordable Housing Program Lead here at the City of Kitchener. Before we begin, I wish to acknowledge the enduring presence of Indigenous peoples on this land for millennia, and that this land on which we meet today virtually is a traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. We recognize our responsibility to serve as stewards for the land and to honor the original caretakers who came before us, recognizing how this community is enriched by the deep-rooted traditions of the diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit in Kitchener today. We also recognize that to do social justice work on this land, we must affirm our commitment to decolonization in our work and in our lives as settlers on this land. This makes our housing work locally all the more important. Through Kitchener's award-winning strategy, Housing for All, we are centering lived expertise and the right to housing, while focusing on what we can do as a city to help create more housing opportunities across the board for everybody. I am thrilled to welcome you to the second session in our Building Equitable Cities speaker series, which is dedicated to building capacity around issues of equity, inclusion, and engaging in the dialogue necessary to disrupt systemic inequity in the establishment, development, and growth of sustainable cities. We are joined today by Jennifer Gordon, Advocacy Director at the YW Kitchener-Waterloo, and Suzanne Charles Watson from the Women's College Hospital. Both are partners in the speaker series. We're also joined by our lovely ASL translators, Christina Forsyth and Sarah Vargo. I'd like to thank them for supporting us in today's conversation. Further, you're also more than welcome to ask questions and vote for the questions you'd like to see answered through the Q&A function at any time during today's session. We'll be answering the questions at the end of the talk. Before we begin, I'd like to use the Zoom polling feature to understand who's joining us today. So in just a second, you should see the question pop up on your screen. Which of these sectors best describes you? And I'll give you about 20 seconds to respond. All right. Hopefully that gave you all enough time. Thanks for participating. Let's take a look at the results. So as you can see on your screen, we're joined by a really wide breadth of folks who are interested in the topic today and who are interested in housing locally. So thank you so much. Our next speaker I'd like to introduce you to is Mayor Vranovic, who will introduce our keynote speaker today. So on to you, Mayor.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew, and good afternoon to everyone. I'm really pleased to be joining you today to kick off this next session of our Building Equitable Cities series with a really amazing guest for you to hear from. A very special thanks to all of you who have been able to join us today. I'm joined today by fellow members of Kitchener Council, including Councillors Marsh, Chapman, and Michaud, as well as our members of our corporate leadership team. A special shout out to Councillor Michaud, who not only is here as a councillor, but also as a member of the team of the YW of Kitchener-Waterloo. We are also joined by councillors, staff members, and local partners from area municipalities, and I want to give a special shout out to the team from the region of Waterloo, who works tirelessly in their leadership of the affordable housing file in our region. The City of Kitchener is pleased to be hosting this event in partnership with the YW of KW, Women's College Hospital, and other partners, because it is through events like these that we can shed light on issues such as accessibility, sustainability, and social justice, as well as identify disparities in city building. It's my pleasure to welcome today's special speaker, Leilani Farha, who I met through my work on the presidency of the United Cities and Local Governments, the Global Association of Local Governments, and in fact where I am today as we continue our work on UN Habitat's New Urban Agenda, something that affordable housing plays a key role in. Leilani Farha, Leilani Farha is the Global Director of the Shift, an international movement to secure the right to housing, and the former UN Special Rapporteur on the right to housing from 2014 through to 2020. The Shift was launched in 2017 with the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and United Cities and Local Governments, and works with multi-level stakeholders around the world including with several city governments in North America and Europe. Leilani's work is animated by the principle that housing is a social good, not a commodity. She has helped develop global human rights standards on the right of housing, including through her topical reports on homelessness, the financialization of housing, informal settlements, rights-based housing strategies, and the first UN guidelines for the implementation of the right to housing. She's the central character in the award-winning documentary Push, regarding the financialization of housing, directed by the Swedish filmmaker Fredrik Gertten. Push is screening around the world and continues the momentum that Leilani and Fredrik now co-host a podcast, Pushback Talks, about finance, housing, and human rights. As mentioned, I have the privilege of knowing Leilani through this work and through my participation on the Right to Housing Municipal Working Group, along with other cities across the country, focusing on helping municipalities implement and advocate for the right to housing. I'd like to conclude by highlighting that throughout the past 2 years of COVID-19, the socioeconomic gap, as we all know, has only grown wider, and this is especially evident in our cities. I know that our city leadership is eager to use what we learned in this series to create a more equitable city for everyone. And now it's my pleasure to turn it over to my colleague and friend Leilani for what you've all been waiting for, the main event. Over to you, Leilani.
Thank you so much, Mayor Vrbanovich. It's a real pleasure to be here and to continue our working relationship. There aren't so many mayors around the world who are as committed as you are to implementing the human right to housing, and I applaud you and your team for your efforts in that regard. So it's just a real and distinct pleasure to be here. I just wanted to mention that I'm here in Ottawa. And I live on what is Anishinaabe territory. And I actually have a little dog that I walk every morning. And we walk along the banks of what's called the Ottawa River now, but used to be called the Kitchissippi River. And the Kitchissippi River is pretty amazing in its history as a place of convening of Indigenous peoples coming together and celebrating life and nature, the natural world, and a real place of community. The Ottawa River stands now between Quebec and Ontario, and it actually acts as a divide. It divides us in terms of language, in terms of religion, and in terms of territory. And so whenever I walk my dog, I have this incredible feeling of what it could be and what it is, and probably where we need to go. So let me now get into the substance of my comments. I wanted to do 3 things for you. I wanted to first just say to you what the right to housing actually means. I wanted to talk about why it's such a game changer for cities and other levels of government. And then I wanted to reflect on how does a human right to housing apply, and very specifically maybe to budget 2022. And then I'll open it up for, I'll be happy to take questions. So, what does the right to housing mean? I like to try to keep things really simple. And in fact, the definition of the right to housing is pretty simple. It's really just the right to live somewhere in peace, security, and with dignity. And I just love that definition because it's so easily applied. So if you're walking down the street and you see someone living in homelessness and they're living in a tent in a park, or they're living on a sidewalk, you can ask yourself, does this person enjoy a dignified life? Do they have, for example, a toilet? Do they have a shower? Do they have all the things that we know are required for a life of dignity, privacy, for example? We can ask, does that person actually enjoy any security? They could be removed from those lands, the park or the sidewalk, so easily by police, for example. if it's a woman living in a tent, or even a man for that matter, you have to ask yourself, well, what kind of security does a zippered enclosure provide? Obviously not much. So you know right away that the right to housing has been triggered by those living circumstances because they're not living with security and dignity. And I carry that definition with me everywhere I go. It's just the easiest test, and very easy for governments to get their heads around. The right to housing means a little bit more than that, though. It is true that we have adequacy standards that have been developed over a fair period of time, both through the UN system as well as through jurisprudence, court cases from around the world. And we know that there are, I would say, 3 real hallmarks of what constitutes adequate housing under international human rights law, and adequate being the key word. And there's 3 things. I've already talked about one of them, security. Well, we call it security of tenure, actually. And that means, does someone enjoy to live in a space without fear of eviction or forced eviction, basically? And that then dovetails with the next criteria of adequacy, which is affordability. So housing is supposed to be, under international human rights law, affordable, and there is a definition, and it's not the one that's most commonly used in political structures and conversations and policy. Affordability under international human rights law relates to household income. It doesn't relate to what a market can command. So when you start seeing things like, well, affordability is measured as 80% of market value, that wouldn't be the definition under international human rights law. The definition would be, is it affordable to that particular household in light of their income? We actually don't use the 30% measure. There isn't a real specific measure like that, but 30% is the rule of thumb. But you can see how affordability and security of tenure might interact. So if a landlord raises the rent basically overnight to an amount that is out of whack with household income, that then decreases that household's security of tenure, because if their income isn't going to go up commensurate with the rent going up, how are they going to make ends meet? They might already have been struggling before the rent went up. And so that you can see how affordability and security of tenure interact. And then the third criteria for adequacy that I'll mention, and there are others, is that housing has to be decent. It has to be in good repair. It has to be energy efficient. Actually, you can't have drafty windows and therefore really exorbitant electricity costs or heating costs, for example. You can't have mold. You can't have lead pipes. Can't have rodents, vermin. All of those things need to be taken care of in order for housing to meet the adequacy standard. I should actually mention one more, which is the cultural appropriateness of housing. Housing isn't adequate if it's not culturally appropriate. And I mention that in particular for 2 reasons. One, obviously that's going to have particular relevance for Indigenous peoples in this country. It's also going to have relevance for newcomers and non-Anglo, non-white family constellations, something that has to be kept in mind. Okay, so that gives you the lay of the land in a really basic and easy, hopefully easy to understand way. So then the question is like, okay, that's all nice, but why is it such a game changer? And I actually say that human rights is transformational, that it can really transform a housing system and how people live. So why is that the case? Well, first of all, I want to say that unlike almost any other framework that I know, the human rights framework recognizes that people, everyday people, are in fact rights holders. That means that they have entitlements, and that absolutely changes how governments should be interacting with people in housing need, people living in homelessness, people living in shelters, anyone, struggling to make ends meet, people experiencing or facing evictions. Because suddenly, when you start thinking about people as rights holders, it changes what that relationship is between governments and the individual. It means that individuals are no longer just beneficiaries of charity, for example, or they're no longer just objects of government beneficence or good deeds, but rather they have entitlements and governments are accountable to the people. So that's the other thing about a human rights framework that makes very clear who is accountable to whom. So governments are accountable to people and people are rights holders. So let me give you a really simple example of how game-changing this actually is. So first of all, just imagine yourself again. I used this example once, I'll use it again. You're walking down the street and you see someone living in homelessness. And you think to yourself, oh, you could think it a number of things, the most stereotypical things. Oh, that person is a drug addict. Oh, that person's a criminal. Oh, that person's lazy. A rights approach asks you to view what you're seeing quite differently. Instead of maybe, oh, there's a criminal or someone lazy or, someone who's just suffering because of their own personal circumstances. A rights approach says, oh, that is the failure of my governments, plural governments, to implement the human right to housing. If housing had been implemented as a human right, we wouldn't have homelessness. So it's a game changer in that way. It's a game changer when you see someone rolling out a sleeping bag in a park or pitching a tent. Instead of viewing that as criminal activity, trespassing, you might view that as a human rights claim, a claim to the right to housing by a rights holder who has nowhere else to live. So I really love that because, again, it forces a reorientation. I hope you're starting to see the transformational nature of a human rights approach. The other thing is that when you acknowledge who is accountable to whom, governments are accountable to people, it requires governments to obviously do something. And the city of Kitchener is a really good example of a government taking quite seriously that they are accountable to the people of Kitchener. And for that reason have adopted a housing strategy that's based in human rights. And that's the exact response to an understanding of the role of government that one would expect to see. That governments recognize that they are accountable and they have to put in place what's necessary to ensure the enjoyment of the right to housing by the people who live within their jurisdiction. The other thing I'll say about the game-changing aspect of the right to housing is that it creates and establishes a set of norms that are universal. And in a very large, vast country like Canada, with many jurisdictions, because we're a federal state, with the provinces having a big role in housing, the prominent constitutional role, it's easy to see some people benefiting more than other people, depending on where you live and what jurisdiction. And if we apply human rights standards, everyone should be lifted up to those human rights standards across the country, whether you're living in the north or the south of the country, the east or the west. It means addressing those housing systems that are, incredibly expensive, like in cities like Vancouver and Toronto, as well as addressing what's happening in, for example, somewhere in PEI. So I like that because we do want our whole society, our country as a whole, to be risen up to enjoy the right to adequate housing, not in some piecemeal fashion. Oh, if you're in Quebec, you're lucky, but if you're in wherever, BC, you're unlucky, or Saskatchewan or whatever, you're unlucky. We wouldn't want that. And so there is something very leveling about having universal norms and standards. And then lastly, I'll say that the part of what makes a rights framework transformational is that human rights are really about the structures and systems in a society that are creating inequalities, that are barriers to enjoyment to the right. And because it has this emphasis on the individual rights holder, it is, and putting them at the center, it enables governments to understand what are the structural barriers. Because you can imagine, imagine being the mayor, dealing with a myriad of issues. Housing is just one, but of many issues that a mayor would have to deal with and city councilors would have to deal with. How is it reasonable to expect a mayor or city councilors, or you can think of other levels of government that are even more removed from people living, people's lived realities? How can we expect governments to actually know what are the systemic barriers? It's very difficult. Governments have to rely on people and their experiences to know this is what's broken in our system. This is what's not working. A perfect example is the setting of welfare rates, which is obviously not a city municipal obligation or responsibility. But when social assistance rates are set, governments might be able to sit, at a table and say, well, the market basket measure is this, and you could probably find a room in a rooming house for this, and probably on a piece of paper could make it seem like social assistance rates are sufficient. And yet, if you actually speak to someone who is in receipt of social assistance or in receipt of a disability entitlement, all you have to do is talk to that person for a few minutes to know how the system is broken, that the levels are too low, that they don't relate to actual costs of housing, that they don't relate to any emergencies or crises that arise within a household. They're not responsive to things like pandemics. So that's what I think is a very potential, that has a potential for transformation with the human rights framework. If we take seriously that people are experts in their own lives, and that they actually know when a system is broken and can identify that for us. And, I know that in Kitchener's rights-based housing strategy, the lived experience is really put front and center. You have, I think, a lived experience advisory group or advisory council. Those sorts of moves are super important because, as I said, how else would the city know what does and doesn't work? So I really love that example coming out of Kitchener. It's one of the few that I know of that has this sort of sitting committee. And I don't know how well it's working, but the fact that it exists is the starting point. And over time, these sorts of mechanisms become stronger and stronger. So with those as my comments on the transformational nature of the right to housing and a human rights approach, I want to just reflect for you on what that might mean if we're sort of looking at a budget or monetary or allocations around housing. And I'll start with this to say, so I am going to use budget 2022 as my example because it's a recent budget, and I think it is a very useful example for a budget that didn't quite get its head around what the human right to housing means. So, and this is important in this country because our federal budgets are what fund a lot of municipal actions and activities with respect to housing and homelessness. So just to reiterate, I think in the program for this event, it was stated that Canada has a National Housing Strategy Act, newish, last couple of years, 3 years, excuse me. And that act affirms that it is the federal government's housing policy to recognize that housing is a fundamental human right. So one would have expected then that budget 2022 would have reflected that policy of the federal government's. And I would say, I'm going to argue that it didn't. And this is why. And I'm going to try to reflect on what it might have looked like if it had. So Canada is in a sort of problematic situation. I think everyone will know, if you don't, that we have a housing crisis here, and I don't use the term crisis lightly. Canada is one of the most expensive housing markets in the world right now. So that's not a great claim to fame. And one of the problems we have is that housing actually drives our economy in many ways. And so in the olden days, let's say in the 70s, housing construction, and mortgages were an important part of our economy, but they were used as a vehicle for economic growth that would benefit a huge swath of the population. And now what we're finding is that housing, it remains a huge part of our economy, but it's housing being used as an investment vehicle by individuals and institutions. And as a result of that, what we're seeing is growing inequality being caused by housing and how housing is being treated. And so for me, that's the landscape we're in. So we have a housing market that is really being dominated by investor-driven demands and by investors themselves. And yet we have huge housing need. We have more than 235,000 people living in homelessness across the country. And I think that number is growing based on what I'm seeing across the country. And we have over 1 million people in core housing need. We know that we have almost 1 million people who are barely, 1 million households who are barely able to make ends meet. And so if we just keep feeding that system, then we are just going to keep feeding inequality and feeding investors and feeding a system that isn't working for those most in need. And I'd like to suggest that Budget 2022, in fact, did just that. So it was an opportunity for the government to really listen to people living in homelessness, people living in rental accommodation that's becoming increasingly unaffordable, and to respond to what they see as barriers to their well-being and to their right to housing. And that's not what we saw in the budget. What we saw mostly was putting more money into our existing structures, our existing policies. We didn't see the government doing some soul searching like, oh, our national housing strategy actually isn't working because we are now one of the most expensive housing markets in the world, because homelessness hasn't been addressed, because tenants are really suffering. There wasn't that kind of reckoning. Instead, there was a pouring in of more resources into an existing system. And that, to me, belies a human rights approach. So what should have happened? That becomes the question. And of course, everyone says there's no silver bullet, and there is no silver bullet. And I remind you that I'm but a lowly human rights lawyer. I am not some housing guru. I'm not even a housing policy person, really. I really am a human rights person. But from a human rights perspective, what should have happened is the scale should have been tipped. So rather than pouring a lot of money into existing build and buy approaches to housing, right? So build more supply, get more people to buy, right? That's what Budget 2022 did. Rather than taking that approach, the government could have taken a big step back, admitted that the national housing strategy wasn't working and hasn't been working, if it has not been effective, should have put some brakes on and said, okay, first and foremost, we need to put into place adequate protections and programs to address housing need and ensure the human right to housing is being enjoyed by the most marginalized groups. That would have required, for example, the government to negotiate with provinces to get in place amendments to landlord-tenant acts, for example, to encourage better protection of tenants, things like stronger protections around how much rents can be increased, vacancy decontrol, all sorts of tenant protections could be put in place. And if I look internationally, I see there's big movement to improve tenant protections in many jurisdictions, particularly in Europe. Things like longer term leases, things like rent freezes for longer than just part of a pandemic, for example. I think that the government would have, if they were taking a human rights approach, would have looked at what we call the financialization of housing very differently than they did. I think they would have looked very squarely at the actors that are creating structural barriers for tenants, the actors who are purchasing apartment buildings and using those apartment buildings as investment and trying to get out of tenants what's necessary to satisfy shareholders who actually are part owners in these buildings. And there was absolutely no attention paid to that big structural issue that tenants across the country are raising alarm bells about. I mean, every week there's a tenant group saying, that they refuse to pay greater rent because of the renovations, that they're going to be evicted, challenging those evictions, challenging increases and above guideline requests for increases in rents. So, I mean, I'm just trying to give you a flavor for the difference a human rights approach would have made to budget 2022. I think what's really needed in this country is a reset and a new conversation about the crisis at hand and some new ideas put on the table on how to address the crisis. And I don't say any of this lightly. I know it's probably, people might say, oh, well, it's easy to be an armchair critic. But I have seen jurisdictions around the world taking a different approach. And I like to use New Zealand as an example. It's a much smaller country, but I had the occasion to visit New Zealand just before the pandemic. And it was an official visit as UN Rapporteur. And one of the things that I applauded the government for was being honest in their own recognition that their housing strategy wasn't working. They had admitted that and had decided to go back to the drawing board, basically, and revision what adequate housing might look like for that country in a way that might be more successful and more effective. Part of what they did was to take a long look at how to better integrate the needs of Indigenous peoples, Maori, in their housing strategy, on the understanding that without addressing Maori need, they would never be able to address broader housing need. And I think that's probably quite true in Canada too. So I'm going to end my comments there only to say that I think human rights can give us the reset that we need. And I want to reiterate that Kitchener as a city is doing something quite unusual and quite bold by recognizing that housing is a human right, incorporating that into the city's strategy. But I want to say that I'm fearful for Kitchener because I think you need better partners. I think you need partners at both the provincial and federal level that are as committed to the human right to housing as the city of Kitchener is. Thanks very much. And thanks to the interpreters. I hope I wasn't speaking too quickly.
Thank you so much, Leilani. I don't know about everybody else, but every time I listen to you, I feel like I can take on a really big system, like all the goosebumps at the back of my neck perk up, and I'm like, I can fight the system. So thank you so much for that. And I think that I hope that everybody leaves here feeling a little bit more empowered and a little bit more knowledgeable on the right to housing and why Kitchener decided to adopt something like that. But moving forward into probably the part that everybody is really interested in is Q&A as well. So building off of what you've said and taking that and asking questions about how to frame it in their own mind. So I just want to remind folks to keep sending those questions. Please upvote the ones you want to hear. And while we likely won't have time to address all the questions, we're going to try and pick a good cross-section of representative questions. So I'll open it up with the first question here. Let's see here. So the first question that we have is this: is realizing the right to housing fundamentally incompatible with private market actors providing the vast majority of housing? If not, what jurisdictions are closest to achieving resolving this tension, and what are their key features?
Yeah, that is the, as I always say, the $220 trillion question. I say $220 trillion question because that's the global value of residential real estate. So residential real estate is the biggest business in the world, bigger than pharmaceuticals, bigger than more value than all the gold ever mined. So, you know, I think that maybe the right to housing is incompatible with the uber commodification of housing. So I like to date where we're at. I think we're in unprecedented times in the last sort of 10 years since the global financial crisis. There is way more money out there than there ever has been before. And money is now cheaper than it ever has been before, although now the Bank of Canada has raised interest rates, making money a little less cheap, but it's still pretty cheap for the big investors. And I do think it's incompatible because what's happened when you treat housing as simply a vehicle for finance or a financial instrument, which is really what it's become, an asset class, right? So it's just a financial instrument. It has no value to investors, to the big institutional investors, beyond what returns can be achieved by investing in it. Why it becomes incompatible with right to housing is because for those investors, the client is the shareholder or whoever's given them money to invest. But in a single family or a multifamily home, the client should be the tenant or the household, the people living there. And so so there is that incompatibility. I will say that. And people might be surprised for me to hear me say that, because in the film Push, I say, is capitalism problematic with respect to the right to housing? And I say no, but capitalism run amok is. So then the question becomes, well, what can we do? So what does that mean? And I think what it means is really curbing the financialization of housing. I would like to see the big institutional investors out of housing, to be honest. I don't know that it's necessary. Now, could that happen overnight? Probably not, given the way our market is structured. And that's kind of what I was trying to get at the beginning around the budget and needing a reset. Housing is so, buy and build is such a huge part of our economy. We're not going to be able to just turn that around overnight. But Canada needs, and this is like way beyond my bandwidth, but Canada needs to start looking to other ways to grow its economy. Like, what, you know, when you have the head of the Bank of Canada applauding economic growth that was completely, at the beginning of the pandemic, that was completely based in investment, which is non-productive, investment in housing, you know, you've got a problem with your economy. So what do we do in the short term? Sorry, this is a long-winded answer. In the short term, what we do is we have to regulate these actors and really regulate them and tax them properly. Capital gains tax. In Singapore, for example, they have started to tax any investor in housing where it's a second or third or fourth property that they own, and the tax increases, so making it prohibitively expensive. That those sorts of measures, but also much better tenant protections. And you know, the fact that when someone leaves a unit, that unit can then be a rental unit, that unit can then be the rent can be raised to any number is hugely problematic. And that's problematic, not just because it allows for rents to increase. It gives landlords the incentive to push tenants out. I have an 86-year-old father living in rental accommodation and he has a financialized landlord. And it's very clear to me what's going on in his building. He and his older friends who've been in the building for a really long time, the landlord would like to see them out so that they can modestly renovate and raise his rent. So hope that answers. And no, there's no perfect jurisdiction. There's lots of little things going on. I mean, Vancouver and British Columbia have some interesting things going on. I would say, around taxation, for example, they have a 1% tax on vacant homes at the city level. They have 15, no, it's much higher than that, 20% now tax on foreign purchases. That has helped a little bit, hasn't solved anything, but it's helped. So there's lots of little things, but I do think rights-based housing strategies are the right way to go. I think Kitchener's decision to go down that path was right, because what you're doing is you're laying that necessary foundation from which all your policies and programs will spring. So you can decide then what to do about Airbnb based on a rights-based approach, what to do about vacant homes based on a rights-based approach, how you're going to lobby different levels of government based on a rights-based approach.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think you touched on a number of things, such as the not unique situation of folks, kind of being pushed out of their rental accommodations and what we've called rent evictions here, but also that we're always looking to other jurisdictions on the perfect silver bullet, which you've stressed is probably doesn't exist, but there's lots of places doing little good things that we could perhaps learn from. So thank you for that. Moving on to our second question. This one's a little bit longer, so I'll read it slowly, and if you need clarification, I can provide that. So how does the right to adequate housing stack up against the right to own private property? Both are included in the Universal Declaration of 1948 and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights of 1966. That came into force in 1976. 46 years later, substantial parts of the population remain inadequately housed. Is this because the right to own private property trumps the right to housing?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. The Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights doesn't have a provision on the right to property, I don't think. I think it's privacy with respect to the home or something like that. But I could stand corrected. Maybe someone can put it in the chat. I can't remember. I think it's Article 9. But anyway, no, the right to property doesn't trump the human right to housing. And it's now understood that the right to housing is pretty much one of the fundamental rights. So the right to life is generally considered the fundamental right, obviously. And the right to housing is so closely tied to the right to life that it is understood as essential. And so there isn't in law a trumping in the way that the question posed, but have property rights trumped the right to housing? Absolutely. And it's probably too complicated to get into all of the land laws that have enabled that over time and history. I think our Indigenous colleagues and friends know this very well, the way in which property rights can be used against a population and asserted against a population. But I like the question because I think that's the moment we're in right now in terms of all of this stuff. I think we're in a moment where and a German colleague from the Berlin housing movement said this to me in a podcast that hasn't aired yet. But she said that she thinks that right now what's being really questioned by tenants and people living in homelessness is property relations. And that's where the revolution needs to happen, is in property relations. And I think that's absolutely right. I actually feel like we're in a special moment where a lot of stuff is up for grabs in terms of conceptually who gets to speak. I mean, if we look at all the backlash around Elon Musk buying Twitter yesterday, right? It's like, why do rich white men get to control free speech? Well, I think these are the sorts of conversations that are really bubbling up right now. It's for me, it's very heartening, very scary, because things like Elon Musk buying Twitter keep happening, but also that there is space for doubters and for questioning. And I think that's really happening in the housing field as well. Tenants are rising up, and people living in homelessness are organizing and saying, hello, no, like, we live in a country with the 10th largest GDP in the country. And if that GDP is so large because of the value of residential real estate, which is part of it, then why are we not benefiting? I mean, we're at a stage where we have to ask, who is economic growth for? When governments talk about, well, we need to grow our economy, for whom? The status quo is up for grabs now, because people are saying, no, you're not going to keep growing the economy so that we can create more billionaires every year and allow homelessness to escalate, because the two they go hand in hand. That's not acceptable anymore. So I think that's the place we're at, where the right to housing will start trumping property rights.
Thank you so much for that insight. So I'm gonna try and combine a few questions here. So bear with me, and if you need it repeating again, I can support you. We're getting really lots of good questions. So so this one is, how do you help governing bodies, such as different levels of government, for instance, we operate in a two-tier system here, as you know, see that they have the responsibility to support street-involved community and unhoused with shelter, housing, and gathering spaces? And further, what is the requirement of governments in terms of supplying for basic needs, such as washrooms and water in settings like encampments?
Yeah, I'm not sure I understood the first part of the question.
Sure.
Can you just repeat it, Andrew?
Sure. So how do you help governing bodies, such as the region or upper tiers of government, see that they have the responsibility to support? Yeah. And I think it's the royal you, not you in particular.
Yeah. Well, it's never easy to get governments to see when they're not performing as they should, and to recognize that they could improve. So it's about asserting what we know to be law, and that what we know governments to have committed to. So it's not just like we are making this stuff up, right? Human rights evolved out of the atrocities of human rights, as articulated in international human rights instruments, evolved out of the atrocities of World War II, on the understanding that without some kind of written commitment and moral compass, things can go very, very wrong. And so we have to keep reminding, I think, governments of the history of this, that if we allow things to continue to go very, very wrong, which they are right now on the housing front, then what we're creating is unhappier, more unequal societies. And who wants to live in that? No one. And that human rights offer us the opportunity to create happier, more cohesive, diverse, and inclusive societies. That human rights aren't, I try to get governments to understand, it's not a stick. Human rights are not a stick. Human rights are a carrot. They're a carrot for the kind of world we can create. And who wouldn't want to do that? And who wouldn't want to examine what they're doing to make sure that they are creating a healthier, happier, a more cohesive society? So Now, do any of those arguments work? Well, that's another question. I'll leave it. I will say, though, I think it's convincing. I mean, I think I've never met a government, for example, I've sat down with many governments. No government has said to me, yeah, we're really proud of the fact that we have so much homelessness. No. Or we're really proud that those who are suffering the worst housing are racialized communities or Indigenous communities. I've never heard any government applaud that. So it means that, in order to have a critical conversation, as they say, you have to agree on something to move forward. And I think you can get governments to agree that the current conditions aren't good enough. So there's your opening. Getting them to recognize that they've made these commitments is another thing. But, the Sustainable Development Goals, those are commitments that governments around the world have made. I just saw yesterday that UN Habitat has said that very few governments or countries are on target for meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. It's very sad. Just to turn to the second part of the question is super important in this country. Encampments are springing up around the country. It's getting to be better weather. We're going to see even more. I'm quite sure of it. Let's be very clear here. Encampments do not and will not ever, in any circumstance, be sufficient to meet a government's obligations with respect to adequate housing. So I want to be very clear about that. I do not consider homeless encampments to be satisfactory in terms of the right to adequate housing. That being said, when an encampment is established, the folks living in that encampment are likely have nowhere else to go that they deem reasonable for them. And they do need access to adequate water and sanitation, food as well. I think that they should also be provided with ways of having generators or whatever, so that they can charge cell phones, et cetera. I mean, they have to be able to live a dignified life in those very, very harsh circumstances. Governments are really loath to do that often because they worry that that will make permanent an encampment. But what governments should be more worried about is how to get those folks into adequate long-term housing. And that should be the priority, and not worrying about, whether this is going to become a permanent fixture. It won't become a permanent fixture if they have a plan for ensuring access to adequate housing. And of course, the starting point for all of that is to actually engage the population that's living in the encampment. Kitchener, I think, offers a good model, and Andrew knows more about it than I do because he's engaged in all of this. But there are cities that are willing to take a different approach to encampments and make sure people have what they need, and at the same time make sure that they're looking for longer term viable options for the community.
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer. And it's such a complex topic, and a topic that cities all across Canada and perhaps all across the world are facing right now. So very tough question to tackle. So thank you so much for that. And we do have 2 minutes left, but the questions are so good. So perhaps we can end off in this one. How can we ensure that different levels of government, including cities, allocate or create policies so that for every number of high-end homes, condos, apartments that are built, a certain number of affordable and supportive housing units are built?
Yeah, that's the question. So I actually think every city, and maybe Kitchener has done this. I know Victoria, for example, has, but cities need an audit of who's living there, what income brackets are living there, who owns the buildings, what rents are being charged, what single family homes are available, what's going to be built, et cetera, and really have a good handle on the needs of the people living in the city and what's going to be coming online. And where things that are coming online aren't meeting the needs, there has to be some kind of adjustment. How that happens is another question, because it might be, for example, that a lot of private market is coming on at market value, but that's not where the need is. And so what's going to happen then? Would the city engage in a rent supplement program? Well, where's the city going to get the money for that? Right. So there's a lot of negotiating and discussion that has to be done. But with other levels of government. But the goal should be that, in my opinion, no new supply should be coming online unless it can be proven that it's meeting an actual need. So that's tough. I know that's super tough. But if I were working at city level, I would want to know, okay, so that building is going up and that's meeting what need in my population exactly. That's not how development happens in this country at the moment. It's quite worrying. I don't know that there's some big game plan. I don't think there is. So it is up to each municipality, it seems, to try to figure it out.
Yeah, thank you. And again, a hard question to tackle, but we really appreciate your candor and the way you don't mince words. So it's refreshing, and I'm sure everyone thinks it's refreshing as well. And I think that we're all going to take home what was said today, especially during the Q&A, but also what you had to offer on the right to housing, and really see how we can further that in our own work. Everybody who's joined us today in our own work. So thank you so much, Leilani, for coming out and sharing your knowledge with us. I'd also like to thank the City of Kitchener team for the collaboration with our partners, the YW Kitchener-Waterloo, the YW Cambridge, the Feminist Shift, and the Women's College Hospital. And thank you for joining us today as we continue to imagine new possibilities and innovative ways of thinking through the old challenges of access, sustainability, and social justice in our cities. I hope that you will join us for the entire series as we learn about emerging research and best practices around placemaking and the growth of city spaces. So stay tuned for more to come. And if you'd like to be notified about the next event in the series, continue the discussion on this session and others over the coming weeks and months, or if you'd be willing to provide your feedback on the session through a short 2-minute survey, please visit the link that now appears in the chat. It is engagewr.ca/speaker-series. And so until we meet again, let's continue the conversation around building more equitable cities. And thank you once again, Leilani, so much for joining us today. And I'd like to encourage everybody to stay safe and be well.
Thanks so much, Andrew. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much.